Thank you, Rob, for the very kind introduction. It's a real privilege and honor to be here. And want to thank Dean Birdsell, thank Mr. and Mrs. Engelman and their family members. I want to thank Linda Haley for all the work in putting this together. And back to Rob, I want to thank Rob Smith. To be here at Baruch tonight, to be introduced by Rob is a real joy. I also want to thank all of you for coming out. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I want to talk tonight about, largely about my book, and I spent 12 years in Los Angeles on the other coast, following a group of undocumented young people. But this is a bigger arc, and I was reminded, I had my birthday a week ago Saturday, and I was reminded as I was in San Antonio, trying to get out of San Antonio, the huge conference and the fiesta that was going on. That was 25 years ago on that day. I was a senior in college in Colorado, just about to graduate and contemplating my next steps. My next steps, that summer of 1992, I moved to Chicago. And I moved to Chicago because I had been on a program, an off-campus study program in Chicago, an urban studies program that I later taught on. And one of my students, Andrew Scott, from what, 15, 16 years ago, is here today, amazingly. But I moved to Chicago in the early 1990s, and I took a job where I had been interning about a year before. And I moved into a neighborhood that was a port of entry neighborhood for immigrant families, largely Mexican, also Polish, and a few Puerto Rican families. But I lived and worked in that neighborhood for 10 years. My first job, I lived literally down the alley from a community center where I worked. 2 years later, I moved 4 blocks down the street and took on the director of a youth programs position in another community center. But living and working in that community alongside of children and youth gave me a real worm's eye view of the ways in which larger processes, immigration, education, policing, how these larger processes were framing people's everyday worlds. It also gave me a long view of the way in which these processes were working out over time. So for many of our neighborhood youth, as they moved into their 7th, 8th, 9th grade year, we started noticing a trend, and that was that many of them, because of their immigration status or lack of a status, were hitting dead ends. So their friends were moving forward, their friends were getting driver's licenses, they were taking after-school jobs, they were thinking about college, starting to apply for college, getting financial aid for college. But a large segment of our community's youth were hitting a wall. They were unable to move forward with their friends. Many of the young people in our community, unfortunately, didn't make it out of high school. They became too disillusioned. They couldn't see their future anymore, had become too frustrated, and nobody around them had answers for them. A smaller number of these young people were making it to their senior year in high school, wanting to go to college. But there wasn't in-state tuition in the state of Illinois at that time, and very few people in the community really knew how to navigate a system for these young people. So I mentioned I worked at a couple of community centers, and they were very progressive in terms of their politics, and many of my coworkers had started a workers' center and were using a human rights frame to really think about, to analyze the plight of undocumented workers. But very few people in the community knew about this other demographic of children who didn't have legal status. Right? But here they were in front of our own eyes growing up. Right? And we didn't have a lot of answers. And so it's in this context that I meet a boy named Alex. I met Alex when he was 6 years old. Alex was, had come to the U.S., had moved to Chicago with his parents and an older brother 2 years prior. Alex's mom came to my program to enroll him, and I really took a liking to Alex immediately. Alex was a very quiet and shy kid, but he loved to draw, and he loved to paint. And so after school, he would sit by himself, and he would draw and paint, and he'd lose himself in his fantasy world. And this was his reality for several years. And over the years, we tried to do what we could to support that, as we did for other of our kids in the programs. We invested money to pay for sketch pads, to buy paints for Alex, to enroll Alex in weekend art classes at the Art Institute in Chicago. By the time Alex was in 8th grade, he was the primary artist on 3 murals in his community. And people around him thought, wow, this kid is really talented. He's really going to go somewhere. So we had this great idea. We thought, well, maybe we could try to get him into a private art school. There was a very prestigious art school nearby. People told us the kids from this neighborhood don't go to this kind of school, but we really believed that Alex had a shot. So we did the really hard work of convincing Alex's parents that he would, in addition to the arts, he would take a regular curriculum. He'd be taking math classes, he'd take history classes, he'd be reading books. But in addition, he would have a unique opportunity, right, to really develop his talents as an artist. So his parents are on board. We fundraised enough money through dances and bake sales and taco sales to come up with about a first semester tuition. We were very confident that he'd be eligible for scholarships. So everything is lining up very nicely, and Alex, in the middle of his 8th grade year, he gets his application, he takes it home. He takes his application home, he's sitting at the kitchen table, he's filling it out. He comes to a space with 9 dashes, asking for his Social Security number. So he turns to his mom, he says, Mom, can you get out my paperwork? I'm filling out my application, I need to know my Social Security number. So his mom takes what I imagine to be a very long, uncomfortable pause. And she looks up and she says, you know what, son, you don't have one. You don't have a Social Security number. Alex said, what do you mean, Mom, I don't have a Social Security number? Alex's parents came to Chicago during the wake of the last legalization in the late 1980s and knew people from their hometown that had become legalized through our last legalization. And they thought that by the time that this would be an issue, that they would either have adjusted their status or the laws would have changed. But here's Alex and his mom sitting around the kitchen table, and Alex has this new news, and he doesn't know what to do with it. He's frustrated. He's angry. He's upset with his parents. So eventually he calls me, and I call together a group of people from the community, and we decide that we would go to the admissions office. We'd make an appointment, and we'd talk to them. So we do that. We do just that. We get an appointment. We bring his portfolio. We start going through his portfolio, and as we're looking at some photos of some of his drawings that had won art contests, some of his murals that he had painted, some of his earlier work, we're very confident that he was more than competitive for this school. Until we got a series of questions that we weren't prepared for. So what are you telling us? Are you saying that this boy is an illegal Mexican? Yes, he doesn't have legal status, that's correct. Well, how did he get here? How's he been able to go to school? Where's his border pass? Now remember, we're in Illinois. I'm not sure what kind of border he would be crossing to and from to get to school, but nevertheless, we tried to answer the questions as best as we could. Until we were stopped again. I'm sorry, sir, but since this boy is, again, in their words, quote unquote, illegal Mexican, he cannot be considered for admission to our school. So we're devastated. Alex Alex does not know what to do. He's very angry, he's frustrated, he's disillusioned, but he starts his 9th grade year. He starts his 9th grade year at his neighborhood high school, a school that at the time was graduating about 50% of its freshman class. We've done all of this great work around connecting him to this idea of the art school, but we didn't do the important work then of connecting him to teachers and counselors at his high school. His first semester at school of his freshman year, he learns that he cannot take driver's ed. As an undocumented immigrant in the state of Illinois, he was not eligible to get a driver's license, so he could not take driver's ed with his friends. His friends were going out after school, playing video games, eating snacks, hamburgers. He knew that his parents didn't have the money to afford to give him an allowance every day, so he wanted to take a job, an after-school job like his other friends. And then he learned he couldn't work. So one by one, barriers were erected in front of Alex's pathway for the first time in his young life. So I'm very sad to say that Alex didn't finish. He didn't finish his freshman year. And this really hit me hard. And for a long time after this, I spent a lot of time asking myself, what did I miss? And what happened in this boy's life to send his world spiraling downward so fast? Fast forward a couple of years, and I'm in a graduate program in Southern California, in Irvine. I've been doing community work in Chicago for so long, I get to very suburban, plastic Irvine, no offense to anybody here from Southern California. I'm very, very restless there, and so I start hanging out in nearby cities, Santa Ana, Anaheim, Long Beach, East Los Angeles, South Central LA, and I'm meeting other young people with very similar stories. Had come to the U.S. at 6 months old, at 2 years old, at 5 years old, had grown up alongside of American-born friends and peers, but at a critical time in their lives, as a world of independence was opening up to their peers, right, as they're moving through very important, very defining American rites of passage, right, these avenues were being shut off to them. So this begins this 12-year inquiry into this basic question: what happens to undocumented children as they make critical transitions through adolescence and young adulthood? So, recent events, for those who've been paying attention, have me thinking a great deal about young people. I think about my son. I think about the middle schoolers I recently met at Umani Academy in East Boston. And I think about my students and how they will respond in the months and the years ahead to a changing world around them. Immigration has been front and center, to be sure, in the events of the last year, the last month, the last week, if we turn to Texas and what's happening in Texas. And it's been in the hearts and minds of many of us. I'm still trying to wrap my head around everything that's transpired since November in particular, and the implications of it all moving forward. But I want to share with you tonight what I've learned over the last decade and a half. And I want to start with time. Certainly over the last 12 years, a lot has changed. A lot has changed in my own life. I moved from California to the state of Washington, back to Chicago, now to the Boston area. I've gotten married. I have a son who's 3 years old now. But time in a different sense. You know, our lawmakers like to say that change takes time. Right? Indeed, if we think about progressive change in this country, it's taken years, if not decades, to move. Right? And the policy-making process is incremental. Right? But these ideas don't square with the everyday realities of children and their parents, right? Who are doing their best to get home at the end of the day, doing their best to eke out a living that's not defined by their status, right? Nevertheless, So how did we get here? Our immigration today has really been framed by an inability of our Congress to pass a comprehensive immigration bill. Right? Most Americans agree from various vantage points, to be sure, right, that our immigration system is broken. Right? It's a dysfunctional system, right, that needs to be fixed. But our lawmakers have not been able, right, to come together to move immigration forward. Meanwhile, communities across this country have faced what UCLA political scientist Gary Segura has called enforcement on steroids. Right? Today we think a lot about our current administration, but to be sure, under the Obama administration, upwards of 2.8 million people were removed from this country. And that has had the effect of sowing fear and anxiety in communities, right? With the knowledge that sitting on a stoop, waiting for the bus, taking a walk in the park, could land somebody in deportation proceedings, in detention and deportation. But families like this have no other choice but to wait. So in my book, Lives in Limbo, I argue that illegality is a master status. And I want to be clear here of one thing. It's really important. By illegality, my use of the I word is not to call people, it's not to use a noun to call people a name. But rather, it's to move the attention away from people, right, to our processes, to look at the ways in which our laws and our practices narrowly circumscribe the everyday worlds of people, right? So this concept, master status, dates back several decades. It's an old sociological concept that refers to a particular trait that dominates or overwhelms others. People tend to think about gender or race, for example, as master status. But here I argue that illegality, right, is a master status. Right? So in more common language, it's a binding constraint, a lead weight, if you will. Right? For the young people that I met over time, no matter what, no matter what their initial advantages were, no matter how far they got, there's this lead weight that eventually brought them down. And I want to say more about that. But first I want to put into context is that today close to 11 million people live in an undocumented residency status, right? We turn on the news, sometimes that number is inflated, upwards of 20, 25 million, right? And again, right, as often we hear this population spoken of in very broad brush stroke terms. Right, is this kind of monolithic mass of undocumented workers. Right? The reality is that more than 2 million of these of this population has been here since childhood. Right? Sociologist Doug Massey argues that the beefing up of our border over the last couple of decades has radically transformed patterns that were once circular. Whereby migrants would leave their spouses and their children at home and make the journey to the United States, work several months at a time, and go back. Right? But starting in the late 1980s, accelerating through the 90s, right, we started building longer and taller and thicker fences, putting more agents on the border, and investing billions in surveillance technology. Right? As a result, the act of crossing became a lot more difficult, a lot more costly, and a lot more dangerous. Right? So rather than going back and forth, right, is that migrants brought their families to live with them in the United States. Right? So we see, for the first time in our history, in large numbers, a large settled population, right, of undocumented immigrants who are making their homes in the United States. Right, and growing numbers of children, right, who live in our communities, who go to our schools, who grow up, right, in the United States. In fact, the vast majority of undocumented immigrants have been here for more than 15 years. Right, it's a population of stayers. But for these kids, this presents profound dilemmas. So our Supreme Court in 1982, in a court case called Plyler versus Doe, the court ruled that the children of undocumented immigrants, that states could not deny them access to a K through 12 education. Right? Plyler is very important. As a result of Plyler, tens of thousands of undocumented kids graduate from our schools every year. Right? But Plyler's reach was limited. Plyler didn't address education beyond K through 12, right? And it didn't address life beyond school. Right? So these kids are leaving school to uncertain futures. Right? They can attend school legally, but can't work legally, can't vote, are not eligible for financial aid, can't drive in most states, can be deported at any time. Right? So our laws treat children and adults differently, but don't account for the continuity of children becoming adults. So as undocumented children make transitions to adolescence and young adulthood, they move from a protected to an unprotected status, from an inclusion to an exclusion, from a de facto legal to, quote, unquote, illegal in the pejorative. Now, a couple words about my study in Los Angeles. So I spent several years across 5 counties in Los Angeles. Anybody here from California? Oh, a couple. If you are from California, Southern California in particular, or if you've been there, you would know that I could have just as well carried out an ethnography of driving. I spent a lot of time in the car. Right? So over 12 years, I followed 150 young people, 2 groups. I was inspired. When I was in college, I read Jay McLeod's Ain't No Making It and Paul Willis's Learning to Labor, and was inspired by those works. And so I sampled 2 groups of young people, a group I call college goers, and these were high achievers. Many people in the media call them dreamers. Right? The college goers in my sample had at least 2 years of college education. On the other hand, I wanted to know the experience of those young people that weren't as fortunate. So roughly half of the 150 are young people who left school at or before their high school graduation. Right? So very, very different trajectories. So, for the young people that I met, the inclusion into the K-12 system provided them important opportunities to deepen connections with their peers and teachers, and most importantly, provided them the same experiences as their similarly situated peers. They went to school, they grew up to a daily Pledge of Allegiance, to Barney and the Power Rangers, they dated, they socialized, they went to prom in lockstep with their peers, right? But the dawning of adolescence for them brought about significant changes as their friends, again, began to get driver's licenses, take after-school jobs, think about college. They were legally barred from participating. For most, this was their first encounter with their legal limitations. And for many, this was their initial awareness of their undocumented status. So in the following slides, I want to demonstrate what I've conceptualized as the transition to illegality. So more general scholarship on the transition to adulthood has provided important frameworks from which to understand this developmentally dense period as young people begin to exit roles of dependence and take on a number of adult roles. Here I turn this concept on its head. So as undocumented children begin to make adolescence and adult transitions, they transition to lives narrowly defined and narrowly circumscribed by their status. So first I want to talk about childhood. And to underscore this, one of my favorite philosophers, Bruce Springsteen, in his new book, Bruce Springsteen opens his book. He says, "I am 10 years old and I know every crack, bone, and crevice in the crumbling sidewalk, running up and down Randolph, my street. Here on passing afternoons, I am Hannibal crossing the Alps, GIs locked in vicious mountain combat, and countless cowboy heroes traversing the rocky trails of Sierra Nevada. With my belly to the stone, alongside the tiny anthills that pop up volcanically where dirt and concrete meet, my world sprawls on into infinity, or at least to Peter McDermott's house on the corner of Lincoln and Randolph, 1 block up. On these streets, I have been rolled in my baby carriage, learned how to walk, been taught by my grandfather to ride a bike, and fought and ran from some of my first fistfights. I learned the depth and comfort of real relationships, felt my early sexual stirrings, and on the evenings before air conditioning, watched the porches fill with neighbors seeking conversation and respite from the summer heat. So why do I turn to Bruce Springsteen here? Because I think that Springsteen really gets it, right? And in his words, describing what it means to grow roots in one's community, right? What it means to know one's neighborhood like the back of your hand. Right? Another philosopher, geographer, Yifan Chuan, he describes this, he says, abstract knowledge about a place can be acquired in short order if one is diligent. But the feel of the place takes longer to acquire. It's made up of experiences, mostly fleeting and undramatic, repeated day after day after day and over the span of years. It's a unique blend of sights, sounds, and smells, a unique harmony of natural and artificial rhythms, such as times of sunrise and sunsets, of work and play. The feeling of place is registered in one's muscles and bones. Knowing a place in the above sense clearly takes time. It's a subconscious kind of learning, of knowing rather. Right? So for the young people that I met, right, could conjure up very detailed images of their home, of the blocks where they grew up, of the parks, of the places where they played, of their friends and neighbors. They were rooted in these communities. Right? This was their experience. But again, adolescence brought changes. Right? And here's a young man, his friends call him Rudy, and Rudy told me, he says, well, you know what? I never actually felt like I was born here. Because when I came here, I was like 10 and a half. I went to school, I learned the language, but I first felt like I was really out of place when I graduated from high school, when I tried to get a job. And I asked him, I said, Rudy, why was this? He said, well, because I didn't have a social security number. Well, I didn't even know. I didn't even know what that meant. You know, legal, illegal. I didn't even know what that was. I asked my mom, and she said, it's in the process. In the process? I didn't even know what that meant. I don't know why she would tell us that. So for many like Rudy that I met, right, as was the case with Alex, there was not a knowledge of their status, right, until a very defining moment. Others told me that they knew as children, right, that their parents had told them that they knew as children, but really only became salient in their own lives when it was matched with experiences of exclusion, right? When they started hitting these walls. So here's Rudy again. He says, but when I actually wanted to get a job, I couldn't. I couldn't because I didn't have a social security number. So my first job was cleaning carpets, helping out my dad. Young people like Rudy and others look at their parents. They can't help but to compare themselves. They have education that far surpasses those of their parents. They speak English with a much greater fluency. Right? But here they are in the same circumstances, right? The same limited range of choices. Their parents brought them to this country so they could have better lives, not to be cleaning carpets. Here's Sergio, and Sergio is a young man that I met very early in my study. Sergio here is describing an incident where he went to the DMV to learn that he didn't have status. He said, that really sucked. I had been all like, I'm going to get my car before all of you, to his friends, but I couldn't. It was unfair, and I had to, what could I do? How could I tell them that I can't drive? I can't get my license. It really messed me up. So Sergio's very colloquial terms, that really sucked, really messed me up, really powerfully underscore this experience, right? The sting of this experience. Right? So by now, I think many of us have heard many of these stories of blocked access. Right? We've heard them. Senator Dick Durbin, he often carts out these very large photographs onto the floor of the Senate. We've heard many of these stories in our media. But less talked about is the power of stigma. And I want to really underscore the profound effects of stigma and stigma management. And here for the young people that I met, stigma management, right, served as a secondary border reinforcing legal exclusions. Right? So think about this. I won't ask people to raise their hands, but I bet you the vast majority of us in this room tonight have held a secret, have kept some secret in our lives. And what does it take to keep a secret? Sometimes it's really hard, but oftentimes it bleeds into other areas of your life. Right? It's hard to keep a secret compartmentalized. And so what I mean by this is that for many of the young people that I met, right, this keeping a secret, right, became lying. And this lie of, well, how do you explain to friends why you're on the bus, living in Los Angeles, where a 7-mile commute is about 2.5 hours and 3 transfers? Why are you taking the bus? Right? Or the salutatorian of her class who has taken a gap year that turned into 2 years, that turned into 3, and now 4. What is she doing? Right? Or having to explain to friends why you had to turn down that dream job. Right? So what happened is that many young people, like Grace here, started to withdraw. They just withdrew from their friend networks, trying to keep secrets from their friends, their teachers, and in some cases, their romantic partners. Grace told me, she said, I just stopped going out. I was tired of asking for a ride and coming up with excuses. And every time it was a hassle with my friends. They wouldn't let it go. So I started telling them I was too busy with school. At first, they didn't like that, but after a while, they stopped inviting me. I ended up spending a lot of weekends by myself because most of my friends don't call me anymore. And it's such a hassle to explain everything to people, and it's affected the way I am when I meet new people. She said, I used to be very outgoing, but now I try to keep my guard up. I try not to get too close to people. About a month after my first interview with Grace, I ran into her on our college campus. So Grace was a health promoter in her community, and she was always dressed, she always looked the part of an executive director. Right? When I saw her, it looked like she hadn't slept in days. It looked like she had been crying for several days. So I asked her if she wanted to talk about it. So we went to a cafe, and she explained that she had recently broken up with her boyfriend. And it had taken a real toll on her. So she had been dating this man for almost a year. She had come very close on numerous times to disclosing her status to him, but something just didn't feel right, and so she never did. But here they were on a weekend, having breakfast at his place. TV is on in the background, they're chit-chatting, and then an immigration segment comes on the TV. And the boyfriend starts yelling at the TV, those damn Mexicans, they should all go back. So you can imagine, Grace didn't say anything. She told me that the next day, she called her boyfriend. She said that she had become too busy with school and work. She couldn't balance a relationship. She had to swallow the hurt and move on with her life. But it was very hard for her. So for many of these young people, they face a real conundrum. Adolescence for them brings a succession of blocked opportunities, right, that doesn't allow them to move forward into adult roles. Right? But oftentimes because of family need, right, this is Los Angeles, very high cost of living, right? Oftentimes in many households, when children are of working age, they go to work. They go to work to help out their parents, right? But this doesn't allow these young people to linger in adolescence, so they're really stuck, right? They can't move forward, but they also can't stay as adolescents. So there's another important story here. When I began this project, I was really interested in mobility pathways, largely around education and employment. But I had not thought enough about how this predicament formed experiences of despair, of sadness, of worry, and of stress. Over time, these things took a toll on the spirits and the bodies of my respondents. It was not always big events, such as not getting into college or deportation of loved ones, but a series of mundane, everyday acts that had life-changing effects and consequences. Almost to the person, my respondents described physical and emotional manifestations of stress. Chronic headaches, toothaches, ulcers, sleep problems, trouble getting out of bed in the morning, thoughts of suicide, attempted suicide. It became very clear, right, the strong link between undocumented status and strained mental health. Here's a young man named Misto. He told me, he says, yeah, I think about it a lot, about his immigration status. He said, I'm always thinking about it. What happens if I get picked up? What if my boss finds out? I get dizzy a lot and my stomach is always hurting. My mom says I have an ulcer. So over time, respondents adapted. So here I want to turn very, very quickly to my comparative work and the diverging experiences of the college goers and early exiters. Before I do, I would be remiss in this long presentation that's very structural. It's a very structural story. Right? If I didn't point out that over the last several years, I've also been witness to young people growing up who exercise a great deal of resilience, right? Who demonstrate agency and self-determination, right? I've been very inspired over the years to see many of these young people, despite very, very high barriers, that many of these young people continue to persist and work hard to carve out lives that are not defined by their immigration status. Certainly seen over the last several years, a movement, right, that is perhaps, I think, that probably that and the Black Lives Matter movement are two of the, I think, more impressive social movements of our time. But by 2012, right, this is right before DACA, about 29 of the college goers had finished college with degrees. Another dozen of them had gone on to post-baccalaureate degrees in social work, in education, in public policy, in healthcare, in law. Right? But none of these young people with college degrees, none of these young people were in a pathway that matched their educational preparation or degrees. Instead, they found themselves in low-wage jobs. They were a year, 2 years out of college trying to figure out what they wanted to do. Their parents need their support. They want to be independent. Right? Young people want to go out and date, want to have money for themselves, right? And so without anywhere to turn, many of them, right, they ended up working in restaurants, right, in call centers, in factories. For the college goers and the early exiters, right after high school, their trajectories are really going like this. Right? As the college goers, they find themselves on college campuses, they're with their peers, they're thinking about their futures. Many of them remain optimistic. Early exiters, on the other hand, right, at 16, 17, 18 years old, right, they're on-the-job training, right? Learning how to navigate adult world without status. But here's Esperanza. Esperanza, for Spanish speakers in the room, the pseudonym that I give her, meaning hope, in Spanish is not without irony. So I'll tell you more about Esperanza in a bit, but this was a few years after her college graduation. And she's describing her employment. Over the years, she said, the people working at those places, like the cooks and the cashiers, they're all really young and I feel really old. Like, what am I doing here if they're all like 16, 17 years old? The others are like senoras who are 35. They dropped out of school, but because they have little kids, they're still working in the restaurant. She said, thinking about it, it makes me feel so stupid. In the factories, too, they asked me, ¿Qué estás haciendo aquí? What are you doing here? You can speak English. You graduated from high school. You can work anywhere. Esperanza tells me that when she applies for a job, on the application, she leaves off her college degree. She believes that employers will not hire her if she tells them that she's a college graduate. So, that year, 2012, on June 15th, President Obama announced a Deferred Action for Child Arrivals program. Right? To provide temporary Social Security numbers, 2-year stays of deportation, work authorization to this group, this very group of young people. Right? More than 750,000 young people now have this status, right? And as a result have taken a giant step towards the American mainstream. Shortly after this announcement, we launched, this announcement, we launched the National Undocumented Research Project. 2013, we carried out about 2,700 surveys with DACA-eligible young adults, and we've been doing interviews in a diverse set of sites, Phoenix, Los Angeles, Atlanta, New York, Chicago, and Columbia, South Carolina, with about 500 young people. These are our broad questions. We want to know how they're experiencing their DACA status post-high school, and we want to know to what extent do other relevant contexts shape whether or not and how young adults are benefiting from DACA. So, we are finding some preliminary evidence of a delayed transition to illegality. Right? Our analysis suggests that DACA beneficiaries, particularly those younger respondents, are experiencing this delay. That is, their new status is providing them critical short-term mobility. It's diminishing fears, lifting hopes, and it's improving their sense of belonging. 16 months into the program, young people that we surveyed were taking on new jobs, they're increasing their earnings, they're building credit through opening bank accounts, credit cards, right, getting driver's licenses, health care, right? Cannot be underscored the significance of this for these young people, for their family members, and for their communities. Right? In addition, about 2/3 of them told us they're less afraid of law enforcement and less afraid of being deported. Right? So many of the mental health experiences that I described earlier, for many of these young people, they're at least subsiding. Right? This is really important. Right? Jen from Columbia, South Carolina told us that he went into a kind of depression during the college application phase. But then when DACA was announced, it instilled a new hope in him. He said, it gave me hope that my future's not up in the air anymore. I can actually work on something and not be afraid that, oh, what if this doesn't happen? I'm not completely undocumented anymore. Right? Max from New York said, I finally feel like I'm part of the U.S., like I'm no longer living in the shadows. I can now work legally. Jenny from Chicago told us, I don't know where I would be right now without DACA. I don't know if I'd be going to school. I don't know if if I would have done the medical assistant program. In some ways, I feel it saved my life. Right? Very, very important. Nevertheless, as we are reminded of each day, DACA is temporary. This was not through federal legislation. It's an administrative program. By definition, it's temporary and partial. And as many of us are aware, it can be eliminated. Moreover, DACA only covers a segment of the population, and our respondents, of course, are part of families and communities that are also in dire need of relief. So what we're seeing, right, is across the country, across our sites, is that people are experiencing DACA differently. So it means one thing, for example, to be a DACA beneficiary in New York City, right? Access to a strong public post-secondary education system, a very a city with an immigrant identity, right? A place that has offered sanctuary and fought off secure communities, right? Versus living in a place like Georgia or South Carolina, right? Not very good public transportation, exclusion from public post-secondary education, right? Enhanced agreements between local law enforcement and ICE, right? So place means something. In the absence of our federal immigration reform, states, counties, and municipalities across the country, right, have tried to solve immigration matters on their own, and what we see is an uneven landscape, right, of policy and practice. And again, for many of these young people, right, young people now have a form of status that really helps to lift not only them but their family members, but their family members continue to be vulnerable. I don't think that I need to remind people of this in this particular political moment. But here's Angela. She said, I'm always scared. What if my mom gets deported out of nowhere? What if my older sister doesn't fix her status? What's going to happen with their daughters? How is my brother-in-law going to take care of things? And how is he going to handle it? They're very close. They live together. It's a lot. There's still a lot of fear in my family. And for many of our other DACA beneficiaries, sorry, I'm one behind. Many of them, and I'm not a psychologist, and I can't give diagnoses, but many of them describe what one might categorize as a post-traumatic stress. And here's a young man named Eddie in Phoenix, right, who has DACA. He's got a driver's license, but he still has fear. He says, I try not to think about deportation. He says, when it does happen, like saying I'm driving fine, driving the speed limit, hands on the wheel, 10 and 2. Then I see a cop behind me. I think, was I speeding? Was I going 5 above the speed limit? Did I turn? When I turned, did I use the signal right? Is he looking at me? Is he looking at my skin? I think, am I going to get deported if I get stopped? Am I going to jail and then get deported? And if I do get deported, am I going to get deported to where I live or I used to live? Or are they going to send me far away? They're going to be like, oh, he lives over here. Let's send him over there. If he does stop me, is he going to take my car away? Where's it going to go? My mom. How are they going to get help? All of that goes through my head. That affects me mentally, physically, and emotionally. Every time I read this, it affects me. Right? This stresses me out. For many young people, right, this is their daily reality. And then finally, many of the young people have been reminded, right, of the partial and especially revocable nature of DACA. Right? Last spring, because of a glitch in the system, hundreds of applications were delayed, renewal applications for DACA. And as a result, even for young people who would send in their renewal on time, many of them ended up falling out of status for a series of weeks and months. Right? Among them, many documented teachers. There are, to my count, more than 200 teachers with DACA across the country. Many of them had to leave their classrooms. Here's Lee from Phoenix said, I just don't understand. I sent the renewal application on time, and I've been told the system is backed up and they're not processing applications on time. I don't know. I did what I was supposed to do, but I had to wait like almost 3 months. And in that time, I was what they called out of status. It really put me back to where I was before. It was that slap in the face reminder that I'm still undocumented, that I'm still vulnerable. I could be arrested and deported like that. It really brought me down. With the election, right, this has become more real, right, for many DACA beneficiaries and their family members, right, and that is that at any time, people have the worry that this status, right, the status can end, right, so these forms of access can be revoked. So I want to conclude with 2 stories. Remember Sergio, who showed up at the DMV? That really sucked, he said. So I met Sergio when he was 20 years old. A few years prior, he had left high school before graduating. I met him in a continuing education program, kind of program where students work independently to make up credits so that they can earn enough credits to graduate. He said he was making great progress. He was very, very enthusiastic about his future. His mother had remarried a green card holder, and this man had, what he thought, had petitioned to sponsor Sergio, his mom, and his brother. On the slide earlier, Rudy, he said something about being in the process. So Sergio thought he was in the process. He thought he was in the process of something. As a result, he wanted to play it safe. He didn't work, he didn't drive. Concentrated on school. A couple years later, he meets a young woman, they fall in love, they end up having a child together. So Sergio, he's 22, 23 years old at the time, and he wants to be better, he wants to do better, or he wants to be able to contribute to his family. So he takes a job. Over this time, nothing had happened with their petition. They were giving large sums of money to somebody they thought was their attorney. Hundreds of dollars here, thousands of dollars here. I need $500 for this new form. This person was a notary public. Was not a lawyer, right? Not an attorney, right? And so ended up taking large sums of money. Years passed by. Sergio's in a job at a plant assembling auto parts, and he finds a young man a coworker who he could carpool with, who lives nearby. His coworker, Caucasian, skinhead guy with tattoos on the crown of his head, looks like somebody who might be profiled by the police. They're driving home one night. Police pull them over. And as the officer is talking to the two young men, he spots a bong in the car. So marijuana paraphernalia. He asks two young men to get out of the car while he and his partner toss the car. In the process of tossing the car, they find a pipe bomb. Explosives. Sergio did not know the contents of the car, or at least so he says, but nevertheless, under the Federal Patriot Act, both he and the driver served time in prison. And after his prison term, he is sent to, not home to his family, to Tijuana, where he starts all over again. Ironically, when I first met Sergio, we had a long conversation about his fondness for Mexico and all things Mexican. He told me that in high school he had once almost gotten an Aztec calendar tattooed to his back. He was a fan of the Chivas soccer team. But he really worried. He had left when he was 2 years old. His Spanish was not fluent. And he told me that he worried that if he went there, that he would be called a pocho. Right? Something akin to a coconut, somebody who was not culturally fluent. Sergio spends years in Tijuana, in and out of homelessness, and finally finds a woman who rents him a room in her place, and he does odd jobs. I still don't know the circumstances, but he finally makes it back home to California to his wife. He now has 3 children. He works at a factory not close, but he walks to work. As a deportee, if he's caught, he faces 10 to 15 years jail time. His world has become very small. And then finally, Esperanza. Esperanza is 31 years old when DACA is announced. She's eligible. So she tells me that she had told her mother and her sisters that she was going to move to Canada. This is before DACA. She was going to move to Canada. She was going to spend a year with them in Milwaukee. Right? DACA is announced, and for her and for others, it's like manna from heaven. Right? She's so excited. She says, you have no idea how thankful I felt when I got included into that. I remember the day I logged into Facebook at the library and my friends messaged me, and she congratulated me on barely making it. She sent me the memo to make me believe it, and when Obama finally made the announcement, after taking forever, I was watching, still incredulous that I had made it. But time had not been so great to Esperanza. She had graduated from a prestigious University of California campus. She had a lot of work experience. She'd been working for several years. But she learned that she had a very thin resume. Right? The kinds of jobs that she wanted, she was not necessarily competitive, right, with younger college students, recent college grads. Right? She tells me, she says, I learned that recruiters do not look for potential when hiring, but for work experience and previous job length. They ask situational questions about your last job to prove your capabilities. Right? Esperanza balances 2 to 3 jobs sometimes. She works in a hotel at the front desk, and sometimes she also, when she needs money, she cleans rooms. Right? So these are the stories of a generation of young people who 16 years ago, when Dick Durbin and others announced the DREAM Act, right? These young people, right, were the poster kids of this proposed legislation. But time for many of them has been very, very cruel. And this is really as we think about the effects of our policy, often thinking forward about what kind of policy that we can draft and what can we do. But very seldom do we pause to reflect on the consequences, right? To look back at the consequences, the human toll, right, that our failed policies have taken. In this talk, in my book, and in my book, I hope that I've been able to present a true-to-life portrait of the young people in this country living with uncertain future, living lives in limbo. This story is to be continued, to be sure. But I think I'll stop there. My wife teases me that I talk slow and I talk a lot, so I really appreciate your patience, and I'm happy if we have time to answer questions, but thank you.
We do have time for a couple of questions. There are 2 microphones on either side of the room, so if you would please just go to a microphone, give us your name and the question you wish to ask.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for a fine description. What are the options, prescriptions that folks in this room who would like to communicate with legislators might ask for?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and thank you for asking. I think that there are a number of asks moving forward. The extent to which our current administration will be open, I think, is a big question. But I think that at minimum, that we've seen DACA has been probably over the last couple of decades probably the most successful program. It's ironic that really our last administration was characterized by mass deportations and by DACA, but keeping DACA, I think, is an important first step. And then I think that we really have to think about what we do with a large segment in our community that are long-term stayers that have really built roots. And
are there any specifics on DACA that might be helpful at this point?
Yeah, so I think that DACA should stay, but I think that oftentimes the policy debate happens up here at the 30,000-foot level, and many of us in communities feel disempowered to do something about it.
But everybody is able to communicate with their legislators.
Yes, and so I think that for DACA, I think keep DACA, if possible, expand it, right? In the short term, and I think that this is what qualitative research, I think, does really well, is that really allows us to see the everyday and the local, right? DREAM Act was introduced 16 years ago. It's been 30 years since the last legalization in this country, right? Change takes time. How do we think about the everyday, right? How do we think about, for those kids and families that we care about, right, making their everyday lives easier? And that's really, how do we think about empowering educators, teachers, counselors, social workers, healthcare professionals, right, police districts, chamber of commerce, right, to inform them, empower them, right, to help these young people and their families lead better lives. Thank you. Other questions?
Hello. Okay. My name is Vicky Barrios. I'm a social worker, and I'm also an activist with a group, Movimiento Cosecha, and we're seeking permanent protection, dignity, and respect for all undocumented folks.
Yep.
But as a social worker, I work with unaccompanied children.
Yeah.
So these are children who make the journey from primarily Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. About 6% come from Mexico, and they're generally by themselves. Sometimes they were family, but they don't come together at the border. I guess my question is, what do you make of the unaccompanied children, and what life looks for them, just in your general knowledge and study? And also, what is your take on sanctuary, if we really can become, in cities, if we really can be sanctuary cities?
Yeah, thank you. I think that, well, I appreciate first your comment on really wanting to uphold the dignity of all members, right? Of all members of the family, of all members of the community, because I think that that's really important. What I happen to study is is kids, and I think kids because a couple decades ago we just didn't have a really good understanding of the circumstances of kids, and I think that that's the case now with unaccompanied children, right? I think that many of us, Rob, I, and others, right, have spent a lot of time trying to figure out the circumstances of these kids who are tied to family members here, right? But the recent waves of unaccompanied children from Central America, I think, present new dilemmas, right? New dilemmas for our lawmakers, for social workers like you, for our institutions. To be sure, these young people are, they interact arguably with a greater number of institutions, right? And so what is best for them, family reunification, what does that look like? What does education look like for them? What does schooling look like for a group of young people who came primarily to work, right? But what is the role of social workers and others who are trying to understand and trying to make a decent life for these young people? And I think people like me have a lot to learn from people like you, who are really on the front lines doing really important work. As for the question of sanctuary, and this is a really important one, I think, in light of what recently happened in Texas with HB4, right? And HB4 is a kind of a show me your papers, is an anti-sanctuary bill that was just passed in Texas, is a kind of show me your papers on steroids. These spaces are really critical, and whether we're creating these spaces and using that name, I think it's important. I think that people feel that our elected officials, that our college presidents have their backs, right? So I think that that's really, it's really important. And I think that what's grown out of this, right, is also community members asking for services, asking for safe spaces, asking for legal services, asking for mental health support, right? And so I think that we've seen, so I think that certainly in an administration that is arguably hostile to some of these, to some of the values that you held up, right? I think that these are more critical now than ever. Thank you. Maybe one last short question and a short answer. I will try.
Please, head to the microphone. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Vladimir. I am 25 years old. I'm sorry, I'm a little emotional. No. I study architecture and I am also undocumented. My mom brought me to this country. Sorry. I came with my mom and my two sisters. And my mom said she want me. I'm sorry, I'm a little emotional. Okay. My mom brought me to this country for a better future. So, me and her, we both work hard in order to pay for school and continue my education. I have a year left to graduate, to become an architect. So my question is, I'm sorry, what is the future for people like me that that will finish the college with a bachelor's degree but doesn't have papers? Like what can people like me can improve their lives when you're going to be in the shadow forever? I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Vladimir, thank you for your question and for your courage.
I'm sorry for being a little emotional. After me, my mom came very young, and I was supposed to be born here because she came for vacations. She was pregnant, and then she decided to go back to Ecuador, and then I was born before the actual plan. But my sister, my second sister, she's actually a very good student, and she's American. The last one is also undocumented like me, but she's in high school. So obviously, I don't want her to experience the same as I do. She's in high school. She's 17 years old, and she has a year left to finish high school. So I want, of course, a better future for my family and for myself. But I don't want my sister to experience the same difficulties I have. I worked 80 hours. I am a full-time student and a full-time worker. I'm like a zombie right now, honestly. I worked last night until 4 a.m. I had a school at 8 a.m. I don't know how I make it, but I make it. But I want to say for people, be strong, you can do it. Everyone can do it. If you really want to continue, if you really want to make your dream come true, just move on. Doesn't matter the walls. Everything will be fine. Thank you.
I think in many ways you answered your question.
I'm sorry.
I think that you answered it more eloquently than I could have. I don't pretend to have a magic ball to know the future, but I think that I think that your words of encouragement and support to people like your sister and to others to keep going, right? To keep going, to seek out support from teachers, from counselors, from your administrators, right? From your employers, right? And the best thing that you could do now, the very best thing that you can do is to keep going, to stay in school, right? To find opportunities, right? And to continue to pursue those opportunities, because at the end of the day, no matter what happens, right, the people can't take that away from you.
Yes. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Roberto Gonzales.